Welcome back to Brennan's breakdowns of the new novel Star Wars Supernatural Encounters by Joe Bongiorno. And in the 6th episode of the series, we'll be covering Supernatural Encounters, Chapter 4. Chapter 4 is found on pages 36 to 41, and these are 5 amazing pages. Here's your final spoiler warning. Now let's get into a brief summary of the contents of this chapter. The entire chapter is the 4th manuscript reading at the Historical Council chambers. As we know, Harry Saldana is reading every word of this chapter to the room full of supporters and skeptics. The words she's reading were written, of course, by Arhul Hextrafon, who here recounts past events, the specifics of what he's looking to discover and discern as a historian, and the setup into the discoveries he will make, including recounting the first moves he will make. He will recount the first planets he will visit, and this is where it'll cut off. Now let's break this thing down. Arhul starts off by saying that he is aware that many of his historian colleagues will scoff at really everything he has to say. He acknowledges that his respectability and character will be subject to discussion and debate, which ultimately, as we have seen in the Historical Council debate section, we know to be the case. Arhul's writings pretty much spot-on predict what the reaction by the historical and scientific community is in this opening paragraph of the chapter. Arhul says that his fascination with the ancient past started when he was a child, and that it had died down to embers over the years, until it was sparked back to blazing life with the incident on Alashan. As mentioned in the previous breakdown in this series, the planet Alashan comes from Star Wars Weekly number 107, in the story World of Fire. The incident on Alashan that he refers to is basically the entire story arc of World of Fire, as well as the 2 following story arcs called The Word for World is Death and The Guardian of Forever, which are found in respectively Star Wars Weekly number 110 for the former and Star Wars Weekly number 113 for the latter. In the next paragraphs, Arhul basically surmises the events of that comic storyline, mentioning some specific names that originated there, such as once again mentioning the City of Forever and mentioning the rebel sidekick on the mission to Alashan, Mickey Shabanar. Arhul mentions that she went with Luke and Leia and were confronted by a powerful killer intelligence left by the Alashanians. The Alashanians are the name given to the extinct and long-vanished original species that lived on Alashan. The Alashanians did not previously have an official designation before here, with supernatural encounters establishing the species' name. The killer intelligence left behind is a reference to the Sentinel, also called the Guardian of Forever, a reptilian creature with great powers that killed several of the rebels with Luke, Leia, and Mickey during the comic events. Arhul mentions that Leia, who had studied the late Professor Arn Harada's methods, was able to decipher the Alashanians' hieroglyphics from the comic. Arn Harada doesn't appear in the comic that Arhul is recounting, but instead is a historian that was pulled from the original Marvel Star Wars comic number 30. He was depicted there as a renowned historian and professor, who it was said had personally tutored Leia during her adolescence. If you read the World of Fire comic arc by itself, it's kind of unbelievable to read how fast Leia is able to decipher ancient alien writings. But with the recontextualization of her having a genius as her teacher in the past, as we know to be true, it makes the original comic seem more in perspective as possible. We are told that Alashan means people of the wing, and foremost ones, which draws a connection to another species. Arhul speculates that the unfamiliar reptilian people depicted in the ancient Alashan culture could be the offspring of the Skytree species, which implies a connection between the Alashanians and the Skytree. The Skytree first appeared in Star Wars Annual number 1 from Marvel Comics. The species also prominently appeared in Abel G. Pena's Skywalker's novel, as well as the Lost Tribe of the Sith Spiral comic book series. This is the first instance of something I love that happens over and over in this book, and that is recontextualization and connections. Take 2 previously existing concepts from the Star Wars EU and kind of link them in a genius way that makes so much sense. We will see this over and over again, and I absolutely adore this effort to make the vastly different concepts from across the amazing Star Wars EU all kind of tied neatly together. Brilliant stuff. Arhul then mentions that the hieroglyphs Leia deciphered depicted an ancient calamity and an ancient monstrous conflict. He postulates that this is during a concept known as the Cosmic Wars, which we will find out a ton about in later chapters. It is an early primitive galaxy-wide epic brawl amongst the primeval species in the ancient stars, and I can't wait to talk more about it later on in the breakdown series. Arwell says here that the Cosmic Wars is an unknown event from the ancient past that resulted in several species having to flee, disappear, or go extinct. This list of alien species that may have been involved in the conflict are the Aranafi, the Arbrans, the Elians, the Indar, the Osarians, the Killiks, the Quas, the Cockitans, the original Yavin inhabitants, and more. The Aranafi species comes from Michael P. Cube McDowell's Black Fleet Crisis Trilogy, Book 1, Before the Storm, where they are mentioned as an alien species that would eventually become the Quonet species, who would then become the modern-day Quella species as of 17 ABY. The Arbrans come from original Marvel Star Wars issue number 67. There they are depicted as a super ancient alien species that had to flee their homeworld after their negative emotions conjured up a green being called the Darker. I personally believe that the Arbrans probably appeared the same physically as that of the Darker. Later EU works fleshed them out to where it was established that the Arbrans, before they disappeared, existed concurrently with the ancient tyrant Zim the Despot. It was also later postulated in the EU that they had a similar language to the ancient Sith species, so we already had a fairly in-depth base of ancient knowledge surrounding this species. So of course they were going to get mentioned here in Supernatural Encounters. Next species mentioned were the Elian, who come from James Luceno's Revenge of the Sith visual dictionary, as well as the Complete Locations sourcebook. They are fleshed out there as the ancient species that lived on the planet Palus Massa, but they mysteriously were blasted out of existence, leaving little trace behind. Afterwards, the Caladan, aka Palus Massans, swooped in and settled the empty world. Nice that the Ilian got mentioned in this list here too. Our next species are the Indar, who are an original species to Supernatural Encounters, hailing from ancient Endor, but we'll find out a lot more about them and their impact in much later chapters. After the Indar, we get a shout to the Asarians, which are named for their first time here. They hail from the planet Osaria, which is the name Supernatural Encounters gives to the previously unnamed Outer Rim planet, the Keeper's World. The Keeper's World, now known to be Osaria, comes from the short comic storyline The Keeper's World, which spanned the comic magazine Pizzazz and split up parts from issue number 1 to issue number 9. In that comic, the planet is mostly wilderness and barren, but hints that the Osarians once existed is shown by ancient structures that shows evidence of a past civilization, named here for the first time, which will be expanded extensively upon in the following chapters of this work. After that, we get another shout out to the Killiks, who had disappeared from the galaxy and then re-emerged recently with Dark Nest, as is mentioned in the opening prologue of the book. The Killiks are mentioned 47 times in this work, so I may as well stop making note of every time they show up. I love having the constant Killik nods in this work though. Love it. After the Killiks, the Qua species are referenced in this list too. The Qua trace their EU origin back to Dark Horse's Star Wars 1998, when they appeared in issue number 24, which is a part of the Infinity's End arc. The Qua appeared prominently afterwards throughout the EU, including in the Dawn of the Jedi comics, SWOTOR, Clone Wars Secret Missions, The Last Jedi novel, and a heap of source books. Finally, in the list named are the Cockhitan species. The Cockhitan species come from a LucasArts sci-fi point-and-click video game called The Dig. The Dig story was initially pitched as a story for an anthology series by Steven Spielberg called Amazing Stories. But due to technological limitations, Spielberg gave the idea to LucasArts, who turned it into a game. The Cockitans come from the planet Cocytus, but they have another name we will learn later on. Star Wars author Alan Dean Foster wrote a novelization of the Dig video game, where the Cocchitan were first mentioned in print. I think the Cocchitan are a fascinating species, and it's an interesting background story on them. Their physical appearance is so bonkers, I love them, and I'm thrilled to think that they exist out there in the past history of Star Wars. Arhul also mentions that the ancient original inhabitants of Yavin 4 were also present in this ancient war. There have been several species in the EU who resided on Yavin 4, even in ancient times, such as the Kratokians who come from Galaxy Magazine number 7 and the Millennium Falcon novel, or Naga Sadow's Sith group from the Tales of the Jedi comics, but neither of these species are likely to be the original inhabitants. After the list, we have yet another mention of the Rakata species from Knights of the Old Republic. What's wild is that we are told here that perhaps the Rakata's infinite empire, which we have long heard was the dominant force in the ancient galaxy, is maybe not that big a deal. Arul speculates that the Rakata were indeed an ancient species, but that their boasts of their great empire were exaggerated, and they were just an associated pawn race serving greater unseen evils. This reframing of the history of Star Wars as we know it is fascinating. To think of bigger evils at play, using the great Rakata as pawns, is terrifying. What could be lurking in the ancient past? Well, we will find out later on. Here's where we get our second hex note, which is regarding how he believes the dates historians ascribe to the Rakata and Infinite Empire's dominance is perhaps erroneous and in error. So perhaps their undisputed long reign was greatly exaggerated in scale and magnitude in relation to the dates ascribed to their feats. It's a fascinating hex note, as Arhul speculates that not every ancient date given by scholars is erroneous, but he believes discernment is indeed required, because the integrity of the ancient record keepers may need to be determined before trusting such dates. Arhul then speculated on how it seems impossible that Leia, even with some background on such things from her time under the tutelage of the aforementioned Professor Harada, was able to decipher the ancient Alashanian people's writings. It strikes him as impossible that she was able to do this so quickly. There was almost no way she could decipher such old hieroglyphs. Arhul does state somewhat comedically here that for the record, the former chief of state was incredibly brilliant. Mentioning Leia as the former chief of state is a position that Leia first attained in Kevin J. Anderson's novel, Champions of the Force. She became chief of state as Mon Mothma stepped down. Leia would step down and return to power several times, serving as chief of state of the New Republic from 11 ABY to 17 ABY, with a brief interim from the former chief of state Mon Mothma again in 17 ABY, before resigning in 18 ABY in correlation with the Corellian trilogy. Leia would succeed Chief of State Punk Gavrasim, who was in office for the Hand of Thrawn duology, by returning to office from 21 ABY to 23 ABY. Her stepping down was first established in R.A. Salvatore's New Jedi Order, Vector Prime, which established that she had stepped down in 23 ABY, and Borsk Phalia was her successor. I think it's somewhat interesting that Arhul refers to her as our former Chief of State. In the next paragraph, it mentions the age before the discovery of hyperspace, and the belief that civilizations from that time evolved independently from one another, given that there wasn't the technology, supposedly, to travel the stars between worlds. The advent of hyperspace was discussed in a short story for the first time in 1996's Tales of the Jedi Companion, which included a short story by George R. Straighton called The Advent of Hyperspace Travel. My good friend Marcel, also known as the Revanchist, has a reading of this short story set sometime before 25,000 BBY on his YouTube channel, for those interested in it. I additionally have a review of this short story up on my YouTube channel as well, in case anyone's interested in learning more about the short story. Arhul mentions next how historians have their own niches and specialties, which prevents them from seeing patterns and crossover between ancient cultures. His example of that is that historians who study Killik writings will only study Killik writings, and thus won't study the writings of other ancient species, such as the Aranafi and Ilian. Arhul says that because of the lack of belief of alien culture meeting up before the hyperdrive, many ancient artifacts are marked as post-hyperspace travel, when they come from perhaps way before that. Arhul here seems to be suggesting that ancient aliens did indeed have interaction with each other even before the hyperdrive, which is a fascinating concept we will see expanded upon much more later on in the work. This is when Arhul reveals that Leia was able to decipher the hieroglyphs so easily because the Alashanian language bears a striking similarity to the written languages of the ancient Kwa, which leads to speculation that a common language existed between the two species when historians previously had believed the two races had not come into contact with each other. It was thought impossible, and yet as Arhul reflects on page 38, no major overhaul or changing of the historical texts. No discussion even about the crazy implications of this discovery is even had. Despite it being known about for 30 years, the scientific and historical community are shown to be too set in their ways to acknowledge the perhaps galaxy-shattering discovery. Fascinating stuff. Arhul then references a Supernatural Encounters original character named Yemen Velikosik, who's an in-universe writer, whose quote we first encountered at the beginning of Chapter 1. As discussed in my Chapter 1 breakdown, Yemen Velikosik is a reference to the real-world Russian pseudoscientist Emanuel Velikovsky. As I speculated last time, I believe in-universe due to the name structure Yemen Velikosik is perhaps a Bothan or Kamasi. Nice to encounter him again here, as well as another new in-universe character named Roll Avid. Roll Avid is an anagram of real-world Egyptologist David Roll. I love how Supernatural Encounters pays homage to real-world historians, scholars, and scientists, with their name anagrams for the brilliant-minded in-universe characters. That's brilliant stuff as always. It's mentioned that Avid and Velikosik's work and suggestions have undergone intense scrutiny by the Society of Intergalactic Studies, which I believe is a new organization that appears here for the first time. It isn't all bad news for the academics here, though, as Arhul notes that he is heartened that as of late, their work is being considered. Qua star temples are mentioned in the next paragraph, which originated with the Qua species in the Infinity's End comic book art. Arhul notes that there is correlation between the Alashanian hieroglyphs and the Qua language, as well as the Zephonian tombs and the ancient language and writings of other ancient species. The Zephonian species, whose tombs were mentioned here, first come from the video game Jedi Fallen Order. Arhul references the Great Library of Ropagu, which is a great library located on the planet Ropagi 2. The Great Library contained thousands of years of history in its archives, curated by the near-human Ropagu people. The Great Library and the Ropagu species, as well as the planet Ropagi 2, all come from the Twin Stars of Kira West Endgame sourcebook by Greg Farshday. Arhul mentions next that the Great Library mentions the portals known as Infinity Gates, an ancient means of transportation across the cosmos that were first referenced in Star Wars number 24. After that, within the EU, Infinity Gates prominently appeared in Dawn of the Jedi and the Clone Wars Secret Mission, amongst a slew of source material. Arhul mentioned how it was through these Infinity Gates that ancient species like the Qua had been able to contact other ancient alien races. This is where we learn some names for the ancient alien races, which will continue to be referred by these titles throughout the rest of the work. The collective of ancient first sentient alien people in the galaxy were dubbed the Firstborn, First Ones, Precursors, Ancients, and Elder Races, all suitably ancient mythic-sounding names. Among the first people that the Qua were said to have contacted were the Gree. The Gree species are known as an ancient people and appeared throughout the EU, known as this ancient wise race. The insectoid people first appeared in Adventure Journal number 8 in the article The Gree Enclave. Arhul even mentions the Gree Enclave by name, and mentioned that he visited a part of the Gree Enclave, which is a region of space that includes several Gree-inhabited planets. The planet Asatian, which appeared in the Old Republic video game, in addition to the original Adventure Journal number 8 article, is mentioned here next. The Gree's giant city ships also come from that article, and here Arhul mentions that he rode on one of these ships once he reached Asatian. The ride on the city ship led him to standing before the Guild Council, he says. The Guild Council was a high organization of a select group of Gree Masters, that also comes from that original Adventure Journal number 8 article. Arhul says that he stood before them by the Arches of the Satican. The Satican is the largest Gree city on Asatian, which traces its origins back to the Gree Enclave, and additionally appeared in the HoloNet News Volume 531 number 54 article titled Dooku Spotted in Gree Enclave. It was there in the city before the Elders that Arhul observed an ancient Gree hypergate, which, as we learn throughout supernatural encounters, have a clear link to the infinity gates of the Qua, something that was hinted at in the expanded universe source material prior to this. The hypergates were ancient wondrous devices of transport from the age of vernal splendor, a time we will learn a lot about much later on in the work. The Gree hypergate first appeared in the West End Games adventure supplement, Graveyard of Alderaan, by Bill Slavicsek. Arhul knows that the Elder Gree had unfortunately not chosen to pass the secrets of the miraculous technology down to the current Gree, and he knows he will sadly not be able to learn whatever the Guild Council does know, unless he makes it worth their while, and so he is prepared. At the end of page 38 we get our third hex note. The hex note mentions that the Asatian city's name is a word that comes from the language of the ancient Qua, an ancient Alishan species language, showing the early connection between both the Gree and Alishanian species. The word Asatian means essentially sanctuary, a fitting name in my opinion, and the Gree people's name even had a meaning to the ancient Qua and Alishanian language, as it means people of goodwill. An incredibly fascinating feature of this book is that we do delve into a lot of the language root breakdowns of words and meanings in the ancient tongues of the galaxy. This is our first instance of that with this hex note. On page 39 we learn that Arhul's gamble has paid off, as the guild were happy to answer Arhul's questions and offer any knowledge they had once he gave them an ancient antique relevant to the Gree people. The artifact being the Kozjak, which first appeared in Adventure Journal number 8. Arhul mentions that his friend Corellia Antilles had stolen the object many years prior. This information comes from Adventure Journal number 14, in the article From the Files of Corellia Antilles. Corellia Antilles herself has already appeared in previous chapters of this book, and she traces her origin back to West End Games material, though she appeared later throughout the entire EU. Arhul mentions how the Tehassan Gree from the planet Tahassa within the Gree Enclave had gotten the artifact back from Antilles originally, which we knew from the two aforementioned Adventure Journal stories, but now in Supernatural Encounters, it mentions that they gave it back to her in secret, without the rest of the Enclave's knowledge, as they wanted her to decrypt it. This leads to our fourth hex note, which mentions that they did this as they knew what a skilled decryptor Corellia was from a popular holo series based on her adventures, called the Corellia Antilles Files. I believe that the actual existence of an in-universe holo series is an original concept to Supernatural Encounters, as previously the article From the Files of Corellia Antilles was just an excerpt from a lecture series she had done to interested people at the Galactic Museum, and not an actual full holo series previously in the lore. So I believe the existence of such a holo series program is original to this hex note here. Arhul made sure that the details on how he had acquired the artifact were obscured, as he mentions not wanting to start any wars amongst the Gree clans, due to the convoluted and complex changing of hands it had already gone through. After presenting the guild with the Kozjak in the city of Satakan on Asatian, Arhul boarded another vessel to the already mentioned Gree planet of Tahassa. On Tahassa, he was granted permission by the Gree to visit the Great Library of Manuals. At the Great Library of Manuals, the Gree kept thousands of records, devices, and artifacts from their ancient history. The Great Library of Manuals comes out of the Gree Enclave Adventure Journal article yet again. Arhul reflects that he could have spent years there, which is a nice detail to suggest just how expansive and detailed this library is. He meets in there with the Text Master, which is a title given to the Gree leader of the Great Library of Manuals. The Text Master comes from the Gree Enclave, in addition to the source book Alien Encounters. The Text Master gives Arhul a personal tour of the halls of the most ancient and forgotten days. Arhul spent weeks researching in here, determining that the ancient Gree had hidden their vast prehistorical knowledge of the galaxy within incredibly dense and hard-to-crack codexes and ciphers within their miraculous devices. This Hall of the Most Ancient and Forgotten Days is a new concept that originated in Supernatural Encounters. During this time there, Arhul is able to uncover evidence for an ancient conflict between the Qua and the Gree, an ancient war that Arhul seemingly finds was a conflict fought over the Infinity Gates being copied by the Gree into the Hyper Gates. This conflict that Arhul unearths is a pre-existing expanded universe concept, The first EU mention of such a conflict between these two ancient species over the Infinity Gates comes from Jason Fry and Daniel Wallace's The Essential Atlas. Arhul mentions that other historians had seen this prior to him, but they had their biases, which caused them to miss the nuance to the conflict. Arhul believed there was a lot more to the ancient war than may have originally appeared. Arhul asked the Gree Keeper of Artifacts, which I believe could be a new name to describe the text master, but this is reading between the lines and not supported conclusively by evidence in the text, if there were other ancient species known to have associated with the prehistoric Gree people. Apparently some of the strange species depicted on the Kozak artifact and on the art in the halls did indeed depict ancient species long forgotten, that the Gree were also in contact with. We also learn for the first time what the artifact's name means here, as Arhul learns that the word Kozak means belligerent wanderers. It is then revealed to Arhul that the Kozak antique is one of several different ancient Gree tablets, known as the Accursed Tablet. This is an original idea to hear. The Accursed Tablets have said to reveal the crimes committed by ancient exiled aliens. What Arhul has discovered here is that despite what conventional modern history suggested about the Primal Age, connections still did exist. From determining the similarities between species' ancient writing and language, to realizing ancient conflicts were fought across the stars between alien people, Arhul is shown to be drawing connections that reveal the picture of the ancient prehistoric galaxy. And what he's found has already contradicted the modern historical view of that era. As most historians would say, contact between such species was unlikely, isolated, or just flat out something that couldn't occur in the pre-hyperspace age. But Arhul's quest for knowledge on the ancient past has already dug up some fascinating information. This is the start of what will spiral into a thirstful journey for knowledge. And I would point to his findings while he was amongst the Gree depicted here as the first big Kickstarter that encouraged him to keep digging. While amongst the Gree, with the benefit of the great teachings he had received from Corellia Antilles, Arhul is able to open up the Kozak to the astonished Gree. The item opens up to a holographic display of several alien beings. Unfortunately for Arhul and the Gree, the language embedded there cannot be determined by either Arhul or the Gree scholars. Arhul asks the Gree assembled there with him who the ancient species depicted were. The knowledgeable Gree historians rattle off a list that includes the Qua, Sinatine, Sharu, Arbrans, Erythros, and Duinaguin peoples. Several of the species in this list have already appeared in previous chapters, and this one, but I'll refresh your memory here briefly on the origin of these races. The Qua first appeared in Star Wars 1998 number 24. The Sinatine species originated in A New Hope, where a member first appeared in the Mos Eisley Cantina. The ancient Sharu originated in the Lando Calrissian trilogy. The Green Arbran people come straight from the original Marvel Comics in issue number 67. The Erythros is a brand new name that originates as a concept in Supernatural Encounters. Way later on we will find out that they are the ancestors of a prominent and well-known expanded universe species. And finally, the amazing Duinaguin people, also called Star Dragons, who were first mentioned in Pizzazz issue number 3's portion of the comic storyline, The Keeper's World. Star Dragons would later appear throughout the expanded universe, including within many West End Games articles, mentions in Galaxy of Fear and Jedi Prince Young Reader series, references in the Thrawn trilogy and New Jedi Order series, and within Wizards of the Coast RPG source material. The Gree elders bestow more knowledge to Arhul when they explain that despite not having the material with which to translate the symbols and writings of these species, they have been instructed rather diligently by their elders through the millennia to not share a meal or interact with these species. While they mention those restrictions have eased somewhat in the modern era, the inference from this revelation is that ancient grudges were held that caused the Gree to be wary of these other species, implying a lot of interaction between the ancient species. Arhul is taken aback by this revelation, as his peers and fellow historians had labeled these various species depicted on ancient Gree artifacts as mythological gods that the primitive Gree worshipped, and not other sentient species that they had actually interacted with, as that would be at odds with, and outright contradict their supposition of separate evolution of the ancient alien species, with no interaction with each other in those ancient stars. Arhul is stunned by the revelation from the Gree he chatted with, and asks them why they didn't correct the researchers whose conclusions were clearly in error. The Gree say their opinion wasn't asked for, and if it was, that the original researchers had already made their minds up anyway, so correcting them would have been fruitless. Arhul asks if the Gree can help him locate the Star Dragon's people so he can speak with them, but the Gree tell him that they are unaware of where he could find them. They also warn him that the Sinatine look down their noses at any efforts to dig into their history, so he will not be welcome to them. Arhul asks who the Erythros are, and the Gree reveal that they are unaware of who exactly the Erythros are, and that people's identity remains a mystery. Arhul mentions how the Qua and Arbrins have long since vanished, so he won't be able to contact them for obvious reasons, which leaves him determined to seek out and contact the Sharu people in his endeavors to seek out the truth. The Gree wish Arhul a very polite good luck, and ask that whatever he finds will be brought back in writing to their library for their study. Arhul says that once his notes are transcribed and edited, he will bring them back personally. The Gree are pleased by Arhul's answer and offer him a surprising courtesy that almost no non-Gree have been given previously, by telling him that he is welcome back to the planet of Tahassa any time. They wish him luck in his quest, and Arhul departs from the planet, traveling back to Asatian. From Asatian, Arhul plots a course from there to the Rafa system. On his way there, he recalls and reflects on the adventures of Lando Calrissian in the system that he is aware of. The Rafa system and Lando's exploits, recollected by Arhul, including the Mind Harp and the Obroan Institute's unfortunate interference in the system, after Lando had left from reawakening the departed Sharu people, all come from L. Neil Smith's Lando Calrissian trilogy, in addition to the source book, The Essential Chronology. Arhul notes that the awakened Sharu experienced a perhaps phony, confused state of amnesia in an effort to finally convince the Obroan researchers to leave their planet and artifacts alone. Arhul mentions that he is grateful for the aid of his trusty droid companion, Q9, who is with him on this journey. Q9 works on gathering all information available on the Sharu in the time since the Sharu had returned after Lando awakened them. Apparently they were terrible record keepers, as the information they had seemingly wildly exaggerated, or perhaps contradictory to each other. Arhul suspects that perhaps the seeming mess of contradictions was perhaps engineered on purpose by them to hide their secrets. Arhul meets with members of the Sharu priesthood, and they tell Arhul that the Sharu people have long somewhat fearfully guarded their past history in the galaxy. The Sharu priesthood tell Arhul that he should visit the planet Karakatok. Karakatok first appeared in Aliens in the Empire Part 1, which was an article published to hyperspace by Abel G. Pena and Rich Handley. The planet would go on to be featured in the Complete Star Wars Encyclopedia and the Essential Atlas. Arhul visits the planet and is disturbed by how eerie the place is. He observes pyramids and ziggurats, as well as a sigil that seems endowed and steeped in darkness, as it will go on to haunt Arhul's dreams for some time. The sigil is linked to a long-departed king of Karakatok, known as Aster. Several unconnected Asters appear in the EU, including a rebel named Aster from the Rebellion comics, and an Imperial aide named Aster from the video game Galaxies and Empire Divided. The planet just gives me the creeps in the way which Arhul talks about it. Arhul mentions the species that are native to Karakatok, the reptilian Shimholt, who first came from the original Marvel Comics in issue number 69. The ancient Shimholt Arhul describes as reclusive and xenophobic, though during the Subterra period they came out of their shells. The Subterra period is a name for a period of galactic history that dated from approximately 8,000 to 7,000 BBY. The Subterra period was mentioned for the first time in 2004's sourcebook, Geonosis and the Outer Rim Worlds. The Shimholt's expansion into friendly relationships with neighboring planets apparently lasted for a few millennia, before they encountered the Nalori Marauders. The Nalori Marauders were first mentioned in the Tales of the Jedi Companion, and were included in a short story about Arca-Jeth and his participation in a conflict called the Hayab Twith Campaigns. In the short story included in the Companion, which I reviewed on my channel, the Nalori Marauders are introduced as the antagonists who fought against the Jedi Order, including a young Jedi Knight Arca-Jeth during these campaigns. Since we know the Nalori Marauders were active around 4000 BBY, we can parse that the Shimholt species expansionist era could have lasted for as much as 4,000 years. The Shimholt conflict with the Nalori Marauders was mentioned in the aforementioned hyperspace article, Aliens in the Empire Part 1. As a result of the conflict between the organization and the Shemalt species, the Shemalt were forced again to seclude themselves from the rest of the galaxy, after the Nalori marauders stole many of their priceless artifacts. The explosive conflict Arhul references as having taken place during the post-Mandarin period, a period of time that takes place from 5000 to 4000 BBY. This period has been given to the out-of-universe Tales of the Jedi comics and surrounding stories as the era in which they take place by some source material, but never explicitly in the text in-universe before now was this name ascribed to this time period. That is original to hear. Very cool. Arhul finds proof in ancient artifacts during his time on Shemalt that the Shemalt people were planning to leave their homeworld, along with another ancient alien species that was part of the Elder Races. This was a very promising trail of breadcrumbs indeed, that could be the first steps for Arhul in finding the key to everything. Also mentioned in the Shemalt High Priest's artifacts was an ancient conflict called the Twilight Wars, which we will find out a lot more about much later on in Supernatural Encounters. The Twilight Wars are a fascinating, important concept that I can't wait to talk about more. But it is here at the end of page 41 that the chapter ends, with Arhul having a clue on what planet to visit next, due to their connection with the Shemalt. Arhul is following a hot trail, and I can't wait to talk about it more next time, when I break down Chapter 5, Secrets of the Keeper. I hope you will all join me then, and I hope you enjoyed my breakdown of Chapter 4. I'll see you guys next time.